everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And today's episode is about something that's near and dear to Alex and my heart, and that is TTL. So Alex, why don't you let everybody know what TTL is, and then we'll discuss when to use it, why not to use it, why to use it, when you should use it, who should use it, all that good stuff.
Okay, well, TTL, the actual initials, stand for through the lens, but are used in photographic terms to refer to controlling a flash gun by the camera. And the camera is looking at the flash output through its lens and therefore controlling the amount of flash that a picture is using. And if you have a little, compact camera or something with a flash gun on it, that camera is probably also controlling that flash through the lens with the built-in camera flash. And you can do the same with an external flash gun, although it usually requires a few different things. In underwater photography, the way this typically works is that actually it's not done during the exposure. It's done very, very quick time before the picture is taken. And it's done by using a pre-flash. So the camera tells the flash to make a pre-flash. It sees how much light is being reflected from the subject by that pre-flash. And then it adjusts the power accordingly so that when it sends its main pulse of flash microseconds later, that main pulse of flash is the right amount of power. And therefore you should get the correct exposure. In order to do this with an underwater flash gun, you typically need kind of two things. You need a flash board inside the housing that either, I think both Icolite and CCAM use this route, either creates the TTL signal to go down electrical cables to the flash guns, or as most of the other housings are doing, that flash trigger board is using LEDs to create a start and stop light for a flash duration that again controls the length of the main flash through that board. And so in both situations you need both a flash gun that is TTL enabled, but there are very few on the market that aren't, although pleasingly there are more. I say pleasingly because you're beginning to get our impression on TTL. But you need both a flash gun that can do TTL, but you also need that right triggering board inside your housing. So it can be quite an expensive thing to get into because you may be able to save yourself money by not getting into it at all, should you want to. But that's basically the setup of it. They sometimes have different prefixes to TTL. In the past we've had STTLs and ITTLs and ETTLs, but they're all kind of doing the same thing. They're just different manufacturers' names for them, or they're trying to, make theirs sound more advanced by adding an extra letter. But generally, they're all just trying to do the same thing. Now, I would say that they're not all completely equal. I do think some of the systems are better refined. It's particularly the trigger boards. Some of the trigger boards, I think, are really well designed. And also some of the flash guns are not that responsive. So there are, some of them are able to really carefully monitor the output. Others, it's kind of, this is close enough. So they're not all created equally. Matthew and I, neither of us routinely shoot TTL, so we're not the source to tell you that this flash gun is particularly good and this one's particularly bad. Because at TTL, we're much more interested in things like quality of light and how nice our pictures will look, not whether the flash gun can do TTL effectively or not. So we tend not to even get into that when we look at flash guns. But that's the basic setup. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Matthew.
Yeah, I've only shot TTL very briefly, just for certain gear reviews. I've reviewed some Icolite stuff and some I can't remember what the other, maybe Olympus, where I tried some TTL stuff. And it's not as infallible as it would be made out to. It would seem to be made out to be. Like we've discussed before, I think when we briefly touched on it, that it can work, but it's not a fail safe by any means. And my humble opinion, you are much better off just learning how to use your flashes in manual than relying on TTL, which may or may not give you the correct result.
Yeah, and I would say that of all the experienced, capable photographers out there whose work your viewers have admired and enjoyed, I would say that 95% plus are shooting with manual strobes. And they're doing that not because they're big and clever. They're doing it because they find it's the best way to get the shots. That said, I do want to do a little bit of cheerleading for TTL, which is not necessarily my view, but I think it's important to say is that I do think that TTL does appeal to you when you are new to underwater
Mhm.
photography. And there's a lot to think about, and maybe you're not that good at thinking things through, and you want the point and shoot simplicity of TTL. And what TTL is kind of good for is you can kind of dial in any kind of settings to your camera. And what TTL should do is you press the shutter and the camera should hopefully give you the right amount of flash. So even if you cock everything else up, your main subject should have about the right amount of flash on it. And there's an appeal to that when you're new and starting out. And I say to people, particularly if I have newer photographers joining me on workshop trips and things, if you're used to shooting TTL, and you're just joining this trip, why not use it for the first day or two? Get yourself back in the zone of shooting underwater photography. Get used to the diving, get used to your buoyancy, get used to holding the camera, get used to thinking about the types of compositions you want, but you don't have to think about anything else. And it's not a bad way to build that confidence up. But ultimately, it's a limitation because as soon as you start getting interested in creating creatively interesting lighting in your pictures, TTL is almost guaranteed to do a very poor job of exposing that because it doesn't know what your creative vision is. It's just trying to make everything look the same every time.
One analogy I can make that I think will probably work is similar to leaving your camera on the auto mode. Like, sure, it can get it right if you're going for something super basic, but if you're trying to have any sort of control over what you want the final output to be or outcome to be of your picture, you're going to need to have control over your different settings. So that's when you would shoot manual mode and you have control over shutter speed and aperture and ISO and all that good stuff instead of relying on the camera to do it. And it's sort of the same thing that you're doing with strobes and TTL, where you're relying on the strobes to hopefully get it correct, or the camera and strobes to hopefully get it correct. Whereas if you're shooting in with your strobes in manual, then you have control over what your final picture is going to be. And I will say, when I was first starting shooting underwater, I had a little Ikelite housing, little Ikelite strobe, and I just put that thing in TTL all the time. I was only shooting macro. I had no idea what I was doing or what I actually wanted out of a picture. I was just hoping the animal would be in the frame. And for that kind of thing, it works perfectly fine. But as soon as you start to care about the actual output of your image or the final product, that's when I would suggest that learning how to use your flashes for real will make a big difference to your photography overall.
What I see in people that maybe have gone beyond those first few shots but are still using TTL is that I see that their photography gets basically controlled by the TTL. Like TTL works perfectly well for nice front lit standard macro subjects where the subject matter
Yeah.
is full in the frame and everything's lighting up. It works fine for wide angle pictures where you have a large subject that's central in the picture. And what I find is people who shoot TTL tend to shoot those two types of shots all the time because those are the shots their TTL works. And when they try other compositions and other ideas, like, oh yeah, I'd like to do some selective lighting in my macro with, with a snoot, suddenly it doesn't. Oh, I don't like snoots. Oh, I want to do, or I want to backlight for my macro picture. Oh no, it doesn't work. The TTL, I don't like backlighting. Or I'm going to shoot my wide angle picture, but I'm not going to have my subject right in the middle of the picture. I'm going to have it off to one side. Oh yeah, the light's not very nice with TTL. I'm not going to do that. And so what TTL does is it forces them down a route where they take certain types of pictures because TTL works in those pictures. And then ultimately they're like, yeah, TTL works in all my pictures. It's really good. And it's like, yeah, but you're just taking the same shots that always work. The limitations of TTL are several. But the one that limits creative lighting is typically underwater photographers use two flash guns. All the TTL systems, the two flash guns are connected to the housing. They're both giving, in standard settings, the same amount of power. And so, which works fine if your subject, say in wide angle, if your subject matter is far away, then generally both strobes are likely to be on the same amount of power to light it evenly. But wide angle pictures are generally not very compelling in underwater photography when your subject is far away. They become compelling when you get close to the subject. And when you get close to the subject and you don't want the subject bang in the middle of the picture, you want to make the frame a little bit more interesting. That if it's a vertical, you might have the subject matter at the bottom of the frame. If you are shooting a horizontal picture, you might have it on one side or the other of the frame. In that situation, your two strobes, if they are on the same power, they will not light the subject matter evenly. And so TTL's default position will always screw up. Even if it gets the exposure estimation completely right, it will never evenly light the subject. And so you put the subject on the side, you take the picture, the side that it's closer to the strobe gets overlit, the side that's further from the strobe gets underlit. And so what photographers do is they recompose, put it in the middle, and then they get TTL works. And that's what drives them down this sort of, so you end up with these very samey shots taken with TTL that are not artistically interesting, being driven by the technology. So that for me is where the flaw is that yes, it can work for wide angle, yes, it can work for macro, but because it can't work for everything, the photographers that use it tend to take the same types of shots again and again and don't progress beyond those types of shots.
Yeah. And that's, yeah. And it's funny you say that, because if you look through the vast majority of my pictures from when I first got a camera to when I started to actually care about the end result, they all look the same. Every single picture looks exactly the same. The only difference is it's a shrimp or it's a angelfish, and there's nothing else that differentiates the actual photos, which is fine if you just want to do field guide stuff and capture what you're seeing. And there are plenty of photographers who like to do that. But if you want to have, like you've said, if you want to have any sort of creative control or creative output, or you care about the final product as an artistic endeavor, then you have to start shooting lighting. You have to have control over your lighting. You can't just rely on the technology, like you said.
Yeah, about 15 years ago, Martin Edge and I, we did a big two-man show day in London for underwater photographers. And people came from all over Europe. And we had 250 underwater photographers there. And the two of us did talks all day. And we also had a question and answer session in that. And in that, one of the photographers put his pictures in. And, you know, they were kind of, he was like, oh, what's wrong with my pictures? I never really get these shots that you get. And Martin looked at his pictures on the screen and went to him, you know, do you dive in a shorty? And the guy was like, what? He goes, do you dive in a short wetsuit? He goes, yes. And he says, I can see that in your photos because your subject is down in the seagrass and you're floating along above the seagrass, aiming down on the subject. Because, you know, you don't want your arms to touch the seagrass because it feels weird. You know, I can see that in your pictures. And everyone was like, wow, Martin's genius. I was like, you know, amazed by that as an answer. But I've had a very similar thing, not with such a big audience, where, you know, I'll see people's pictures in an image review and go, you're shooting TTL. I can tell by your wide angle compositions that your TTL is driving you to shoot this way. And it's a very, very sort of similar thing where people are like, how can you tell from my photo I'm shooting TTL? And it's not because the exposure is right or wrong. It's because the types of compositions that you're shooting are the ones that TTL will work with. And therefore you're continually doing those because it makes your pictures come out, just as you were saying. The other thing, though, I think the main reason that underwater photographers don't use TTL once they start getting interested in the art of underwater photography is because TTL does not do a particularly good job. And actually, it's because it has to make an estimation for every single picture you take. Even if it's right 90% of the time, the 10% of the time it's wrong, it can be very frustrating. And most TTL systems have a compensation on them. So if you're getting too much strobe on the left-hand side of your picture, you can have a negative compensation on that side. So you can turn that strobe down a little bit. The problem is that on the next picture, TTL this time might get the exposure estimation right. And suddenly you'll change and you've had to shoot a picture, go, oh, that's wrong, reach out here, adjust it. By the time you've come back to shooting, you're probably not taking the same picture again. And the TTL will have got it right this time. And now you've got too much power because you just turned it down. So people say, oh yeah, but you can compensate with TTL, but you're compensating a moving target. Whereas the reason that photographers go towards manual is, oh, I've got too much strobe there. I'll turn it down. Now I've got the right amount. You're not, when you make a change, it makes the change to the resulting picture. And photographers realize as well that actually most of the time when you shoot wide angle or macro underwater, you take the pictures from the same distance away. You're likely to be using quite similar ISOs and apertures all the time. So lo and behold, your strobe power is the same most of the time. And I think people, when they first start underwater photography, go, how can you possibly get your strobe power right for every picture? But the moment they go on a dive and actually just leave their strobes on the same power all dive, they quite quickly realize actually you're moving things by a click or two to adjust. It's not massive
Yeah.
changes between pictures, and you quite quickly realize how predictable manual exposure is, and therefore that's what makes it easy.
Yeah, and the other thing with manual is like let me screw it up. I don't want the technology screwing it up. If it's going to mess up, let it be me, because then I can learn how to fix it instead of just yelling at your camera underwater, which I still do anyway, because it's still always the camera's fault. But if you don't have anything else to add, I feel like I would just be piling on. So there's nothing left for me.
No, yeah. So I think I would say as a conclusion, if you're early on in your underwater photography adventures, TTL is a fantastic way to build your enthusiasm, build your confidence, and get used to handling all that gear underwater. And it can be a really good thing to have. The vast majority of underwater photographers, once they get interested in the art of underwater photography, do not want the camera trying to guess what they're doing. They want to be able to create the interesting, unusual, pleasing lighting and compositions that are in their vision. And those are the things that TTL typically suffers with. I think the cause of that suffering is twofold. One, that TTL is typically sending the same power to both flash guns, and that will work in a wide angle shot when the subject matter is central. But the moment it's not, it won't be the right settings. And secondly, TTL will guess right most of the time, but when it guesses wrong, what do? Do you take another shot and hope it guesses right? Or do you make a compensation adjustment and hope it still guesses wrong again and your compensation adjustment corrects it? And that logic is so flawed compared to just going, I got it wrong manually. I'll make an exposure adjustment. Oh, wow, it's right now. And, what we find underwater, because we typically take pictures from the same distances away constantly. Our strobe powers are remarkably consistent through dives. So you're not constantly changing strobe powers on manual. You're making small adjustments between shots. And if you're shooting a series of, say, 10 shots of a scene, they're all going to be on the same settings once you've got that dialed in. So the reason that those experienced photographers are using manual is not because it makes them clever. It's actually because it's the easiest way to get the shot. And that ultimately is why everyone gravitates away from TTL over time, because actually it's an easier way to create the types of images that they want to. And if TTL was easier, we'd all use it, but we don't.
Well, very well said. As always, thank you guys for watching. Please leave any comments, concerns down below the video. If you have any questions, we're happy to do more Q&A ones. We enjoy doing those.
Yeah, and if you are a TTL lover, please, write below the videos. The comments below the videos are really valuable to people watching these videos to understand, this guy has got really nice pictures and he likes TTL for these reasons and it works really well because they dive in thick gloves and it's a real pain playing with strobe powers or whatever it is. So, share those opinions, particularly when they disagree with us, because that is really valuable to anyone who watches the videos.
So as always, thank you guys for watching, and we will see you next time.